right. Cool. We are live, y'all. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Nerdy Christian. Let me just get live on Instagram over here. Oh, or not. Come on, give me the live button. There we go. All right. So today we've got an interesting one. Some of you might have heard of Rudyard Lynch, aka What If Alt Hist, before. I've followed his page for years. I've wanted to talk about some of his stuff for a bit. The reason I haven't previously mainly is due to him reaching different conclusions than I would probably support on like a variety of things. And I how to say this carefully. Sometimes What If Altists entertains some things that I think are concerning or dangerous to entertain. Some crowds entertains their thoughts and their presuppositions and their conclusions. And what I want this episode to be about today is taking the complaints of people who feel neglected in our society and hearing them and being able to take critiques of society critically and kind of take like, yes, this piece is valid, and like, but the conclusion that you reach here, that piece is not. Okay, so this is going to be an episode taking some of those critiques, looking at modernity, looking at concerning trends, looking at these things that drive people to vote for people like Trump, or that drive elements on the left to be quite extreme on their side, or that just are driving increasing fringe ideologies, driving a absolutely ginormous beliefs gap between men and women in modern society. The political gap on them, I think, is 36 points right now for young men ages like 18 to 30, something like that, which is unprecedented in American society, at least. So today we're going to jump into this video titled "Is This the Most Absurd Time in History?" with podcaster Chris Williamson interviewing Rudyard Lynch. And then if we have time, I've got baby here right by me, so I don't know if we'll have time for sure. It kind of depends on how long she's in a good mood because my wife's interviewing someone. But if we have time, we'll jump into some input from someone who actually comes to left-leaning conclusions, who was one of the biggest traders in the world, traders, Traders, for some time in the 2010s-ish, and came to the conclusion that wealth inequality was going to destroy society. And then last of all, perhaps a little bit of a video speaking specifically to concerns of young men and men feeling overlooked and left behind, and kind of validating some of the things that they're feeling while also speaking to the need for a measured and proper and correct response, especially from a Christian perspective. So for those who have not been on this channel before, welcome. I'm Christopher Haylett, aka The Nerdy Christian. Here we talk things culture and media, Christian faith and theology, geopolitics, world affairs, history, all that kind of nerdy stuff, and then the interplay between all three of those things. Okay, so that's basically a bit of what we're doing today, is touching on all of those things. So I hope you enjoy this, and I'm just gonna check out the comments real quick, see who all we got here. Let's see. All right, we're up on Instagram, up on YouTube, and up on TikTok. On TikTok we got okay, someone commented, religious leaders are rushing to codify child marriage laws, and I have the receipts. That's not that's not true. That's just not true at all. No one is trying to codify child marriage laws, particularly in the US. Anyways, let's pop into this this video. So let me just pull up the proper window, and it should be, there we go. All right, everything's showing how it's supposed to. Yep. Gonna move this over a bit. There we go. Let's jump into it.
As a guy who has spent a lot of time studying history, how unusual do you think that the time we're living in right now is?
We are the most absurd era in history by a very significant margin. And I can get into why I think that's true. I think under there's one easy underlying variable that explains all of it. But I invented an acronym called SAW, and SAW is Studies in Ancient Wisdom. And what that means to convey is that there's an underlying shared truth that all the world religions share, all the world's folkways going back thousands of years, and then this is corroborated by modern evidence. And I think this podcast is a great example. You might be like the one of the biggest saw content creators, where what you do is you compare ancient teachings with what modern science says. And so there is a strong tether between the two. And the 20th century is just a bizarre century. And that's true for about a dozen different reasons. The 20th century established different intellectual precedents as it related to mating, as it related to the idea of community, the nation, religion, how economic conditions worked. And so you could kind of call it the blue pill era of history from roughly the world wars until COVID or now. And it's really the century of social engineering. So our era of history is incredibly bizarre. And the irony is that we judge everyone else according to our standard, but our standard is incredibly strange. And so I like to say that a fish in a pond cannot know its place in the world because it only knows the water. And that we are that fish. And the reason we don't study history is because if we started looking for what it taught us, we'd realize we're doing something very, very wrong.
How so?
Oh, a variety of ways. Um, the largest example, and something I frequently like to say, is the idea that's killed the most people in history is the idea that humans are inherently perfectible, where the crisis that started or the world wars in the 20th century's totalitarianism killed over 150 million people. And that's larger than anything else it's in any way comparable in history. And that was based upon the assumption that you can break and mold human nature to be whatever you want. And the blank slate, or the idea that all people are born the same, all people are born with the same capabilities, sounds nice on paper, but in reality, its immediate next jump is totalitarianism, to socially engineer people to reach whatever aim you would like. And that's just one example where there's so many of these. The idea of infinite financial progress, no matter what. This is the idea the left holds up a lot, which is the left sees money as something to divide, not something to create. The reality is money is created every single year by people producing it. And if you look at most of history, most of civilization, stagnation is the norm. It's you have an empire rise, the empire exploits the peasants, they grow weak, they fall, barbarians restart the process. Only for pretty small slivers of history, including ours, for creating up certain incentive structures, do you see very rapid progress. But we take that completely for granted.
So economically, very unique.
I agree with him on the premise that uh, a lot on the left in society see wealth as something to be divided rather than to be created. However, at the same time, there is the inevitability of accumulation and centralization in societies. Or if you look at historical trends and patterns, always power and wealth accumulates until a disruptive force of some sort, be it war, be it political change, be it a variety of things, disaster, some sort of disruptive source ceases or redistributes that accumulation. So look at 1890s US. You actually had, I don't think people in the US understand how horrific the late 19th century was in terms of living standards and essentially a modern feudalism. Instead of people being in the fields, they were in factories. People worked 6 to 7 days a week. They like 40-hour work week. What's that? Like that was not a thing. People were essentially non-enslaved slaves. Like in function, in law or label, they're not slaves, but in function, people were slaves in all but name. I mean, if you're getting paid in a company town, get your paycheck, spend it at the company town store, pay rent to the company town like building owner, like all of your money by your next paycheck is spent back to the company that paid you. Come on. So all of that to say, the concern that I have when people vilify only one side and only speak to kind of one side of political critique, which is sometimes what I see Rudyard Lynch do. He definitely leans right, and even maybe somewhat red pill, is that they ignore the valid criticisms from the other side as well. And I think both sides have valid criticisms, and both sides have checks and balances that are needed to prevent the end fringe concerning disaster result that you can reach, such as 1890s US, which was disrupted in part by my boy Theodore Roosevelt, my personal favorite president. But yeah, that's just something to consider.
What else would be in the the top rungs?
So the idea that men and women are psychologically the same, which is something that our ancestors would view as completely ridiculous. And we view our ancestors as stupid. Our ancestors, if they saw us, if you took a Greek philosopher or a medieval philosopher and brought them to our day, they would say that we had a weird combination of autism and schizophrenia, where the thing with there's a lot of psychology about this, but we have very few records of autism or schizophrenia from the pre-industrial world, where the mental illnesses a society has are driven by the social structure that in the neuroses it puts in the society. So in the Middle Ages, after the Black Death, you would have entire towns break up into dancing as the sort of mania, or people would become witches, or people would have demonic possession. So different society, different psychological neuroses. I have a friend who is an anthropologist.
I just want to speak to this real quick. I have an aunt in her 50s who almost certainly is on the spectrum, but never was labeled as such. I think the challenge here for those who like to say, like, especially those who jump to like the conclusions of like vaccines cause autism and like autism never existed before modern society. It's not that it never existed, it's that we didn't have the language to speak to it. These people were just different, weird, like society just kind of didn't really know how to deal with them or how to empower them or help them, or like they, how to put a label to what was different for them. And you just that's just how it was. Like, personal experience, my aunt never got diagnosed. Now she's actually trying to get diagnosed, and receive some assistance and stuff with that. But like, that's 50 years later than all of that should have happened, just because previously society was not equipped, just didn't understand how, like, what autism was or how to support people with it. So just a little, a note there.
In Cambodia for a bunch of years, and the natives in Cambodia, they literally saw magic in their daily lives. So that's an example. They saw magic, they believed in witchcraft completely, and that was just an obvious part of their worldview. And that's something that separates us from the past, where every single other society in history, and even people in pretty recent history like Charles Darwin, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Karl Marx, Queen Victoria, believed in the spirit world. Belief in the spirit world was completely common among educated people until around 1900. And so, to just go through the list, the idea that history doesn't have any lessons to teach us, that's modern. Men and women are the same. That culture doesn't matter. That genetics doesn't vary across differing populations, that human nature is perfectible, that there is no divine, that there is no spirit world, that economic progress is assured, that war will end, and that, yeah, basically that war is unnecessary. Where the past had this very you could call it realistic sense of the world, where they didn't modernity is motivated by this concept that if we get it right, we can break the entire game and win forever. And the rest of history would view that as completely insane. And I think one of the biggest things my channel talks about is I think we are on the edge of what I call the crisis of the 21st century, which is what I think will be, and it's easy to say that it's going to be the bloodiest crisis in history, because in World War II, just 70 years ago, the world had 1/4 its current population. So it's very easy to have the bloodiest crisis in history when you have 8 times as many people as the pre-industrial world. But I think the crisis that we're about to face in the next 30 years will be the bloodiest crisis in history.
Just to add some nerdiness to what he said about war, in the, what was it, the late 18th century, early 19th century, Karl von Clausewitz was a Prussian general, and he said that war is diplomacy or politics by other means. Similarly, kind of 100 years or so later, Teddy Roosevelt said to speak softly, carry a big stick. Just that war can be a a necessary political tool, particularly for those who might otherwise move to evil or do evil things with absence of relevant, meaningful opposition. Look at Putin in Ukraine. Perfect, like solid example there.
Why?
Yeah. So I'm looking at a bunch.
Why?
Yeah. So I'm looking at a bunch of different models here, and I've triangulated a bunch of different equations to find that we are on the verge of the crisis of the 21st century. And I think it's going to be a global crisis. So let me tell you the different things I'm looking at. One of them is that Peter Turchin and Peter Zeihan's also tapped into this pretty well. I think Zeihan came on your podcast before. If you know Zeihan, you know one side of this, and I have a lot of respect for Zeihan. I think he's done a good job. Peter Turchin, pulling from David Hackett Fisher, saw that the world has these global crises every 250 years that can be predicted by three variables in a computer model. Plugging these three variables retroactively, historically, off these, you can predict the years these crises happen. And what happens in each case is that there's mass war, famine, the decline of the global population, and a change of the social structure as there's political disturbances. In the Western world, the last example of this was the French Revolution and Napoleon. That was 250 years ago. Before then, the religious wars of the 1600s that killed a third of Europe's population. Before then, the Black Death, which killed half of Europe's population. Before then, you have the fall of the Frankish Empire that destroyed centralized government in Western Europe. And you can push these as far back as you want to look. You've got the Bronze Age collapse, you have the fall of the Roman Republic, and these are predicted off three variables. And one of my favorite books ever is The Great Wave by David Hackett Fisher. And he uses inflation to predict this. And you can look at inflation rates to predict when these crises happen. But the three variables are income inequality, decline in average wages, and competition for elite jobs. These three variables can predict when societies have revolutions to the years they take place in. Because the way this variable works is that because all things end up leading to their end, as Aristotle said. Everything ultimately culminates, as Aristotle said, something's great strength will become its greatest weakness when pushed to its extremity. And
that's a good word. That's pretty true.
With a period of peace and population growth, what happens is the value between labor and capital gets destabilized. As the value of labor shrinks, the value of money to manipulate it grows, so inequality goes up. So this explains why the post-World War II era had one of the lowest inequalities in recorded history, while our era has one of the highest inequalities ever. Inequality today is easily in the top 5 to 10 worst periods ever in history. And thus, what happens once the inequality gets that bad and wages stagnate? Because we have done literally everything we could do to depreciate wages. We have doubled the population through natural population growth since World War II. We've imported 50 million immigrants, and that's a lowball number. We've globalized to countries like Mexico, China, Malaysia that have lower labor value. We've imported women into the workforce, and they're 75% of the population. We've done automation, which is actually, people don't think about automation, but it's already probably the second or the third most important variable there. So we have increased the supply of labor by 40%, but we've increased the supply of labor by 40% over what the demand is. So that's why wages go down. It's why.
So I'll let him finish this, and then I've got a comment to make.
Homer Simpson was a lower middle class loser, but he had a wife and kids. His wife stayed at home, 3 kids, owned his house, could go on multiple vacations a year. For upper middle class people today, upper middle class young people, that's out of reach.
So what he says about this is the thing, and this is why I try to speak carefully about these things, because you can take those facts and you can run with conclusions like the red pill crowd, like in the incel kind of perspective, like those who are saying, yeah, society was, who are fairly misogynist, and who would say, yeah, society was never meant for women to be in the workforce. Which, if you look back throughout history, now the single income family is actually the it is not the norm. It's the exception to the rule. It was nice in a period of time. Perhaps it could be argued that it is an ideal for families to only need one income. I mean, I don't see why that. I think that that's a nice thing to have. But you can see why things get tricky here, because everything he said there is true. Like, women entering the workforce, depreciating, contributing to depreciation of wages. Let's take off our political blinders. Let's take off the conclusions different people will run to that are problematic. But when you increase the supply of labor, it decreases the cost of labor. That's just like basic economics. Putting my Master of International Business to use here, right? The thing is, you can then, as a society, say like, okay, yes, that's a cost worth having because this is morally correct. Like, women should have the freedom to work. They shouldn't have to live in their parents' homes until they get married and stuff, which I would say like, yeah, women should be able to do anything vocationally that men can do. And then you can argue like, I think every family should have, it's up to them and their dynamics on whether mom's going to stay home, whether mom's going to continue her career, whatever. That's up to every individual person. So that's something that we can say simultaneously while recognizing things like, yeah, we live in a unique modern era where these different confluence of factors happened, like immigration and women entering the workforce, which are not bad things, but they do have this result. So how are we going to acknowledge that thing that happened to de-weaponize it from those who are on the extremes and on the fringes who want to take that fact and weaponize it? You see what I'm saying? This is why it's so important. A lot of people will avoid people like Rudyard Lynch or people that talk about these things, or just present these things that they're saying, these facts that they bring up as problematic. And I haven't really spoken to it before because I know someone's going to listen to this and misinterpret me. But like, I'm trying to be really specific here so that that doesn't happen. But it's important for us to be able to recognize the factual dynamics of what's being spoken to so that we can then respond to that with, okay, well, you're going to these wrong conclusions from that, though. Here's an alternative conclusion. Here's an alternative path forward, recognizing the things that happened, the effects that happened due to these causes. And some of it is more amoral, where it's like, all right, industrialization. So like the new wave of like artificial intelligence, that's going to devalue labor. Okay, well, what do we do about that? Like, well, we as a society have to figure that out. And that doesn't necessarily have like a moral argument to be made either way, right? Like, it's not, there's no misogyny or feminism at play on either side there. It's just like, we got to figure out what we're going to do as a society in this evolving world. But I hope that makes sense. Like, in the comments, let me know if any of you guys have any thoughts. Eli, yeah, Homer Simpson was a cartoon. However, it was a cartoon representing an American ideal. That I think is the point there. But yes, the amount you mentioned that technology has created a huge number of jobs. That is true, but it's also taken away jobs. I think ultimately that comes to kind of a moot point. More jobs are created by there being more job creators, more entrepreneurs and stuff. That's part of why the American economy is one of the most dynamic and largest in the world, because we have a very entrepreneurial society. But I would not say that technology by default creates jobs, because it's kind of, over the course of history, it kind of evens out. Like, creates jobs, takes jobs away, kind of ends up static. I think in the 21st century, it might take away more jobs than it has before, comparatively in the equation. We'll see. But yeah, that's my bit of controversy there. No one clip me at some point and try to make me sound like a misogynist. But the point of this video is that we need to understand these concerns, these facts, these things that people are worried about, and the roots of them, and respond to them, not with kind of discrediting their concerns, but you can discredit their the solutions they arrive at. Yeah, Millie? Yeah, you agree? And that is where the conversations should be had, rather than avoiding these things altogether, which is what I think actually empowers people like Trump. So I live in South Carolina. We were driving, my wife and I were driving to Myrtle Beach once in like 2021, and we drove through a lot of rural South Carolina. And let me tell you, there are entire towns where most of the town is boarded up. Bank boarded up, ATMs boarded up, school boarded up. And it's just like you drive through these places and you're like, this place has been forgotten. I kind of understand why these people would vote for a populist who says, I see you, right? And so, as Christians and as empathetic members of society and as people who just want to prevent more extremist ideology from flourishing, it's important for us to recognize the real pains and real roots of these conversations, and that allow people to be susceptible to populist leaders on the right or the left, and to instead acknowledge those things and direct them to healthier solutions. So that's the end of my little diatribe there. But yeah, let's go on.
The quality of life has declined precipitously since the post-war period. And this is something that we've been really gaslighted about, but you can look at a variety of metrics between spending power, between ability to own a home, even stuff like height or sleep quality or obesity. And for example, over history, whenever the average age of marriage goes above 28, you're going to have a political crisis. So before the Black Death, people were getting married past age 28. Before,
But you're not saying that people getting married after 28 caused the Black Death.
no, humans, what I like to say is humans are designed to breed first and be rational later. So what happens when you pull out the incentive structure with a society, because we live in a society where people are working too many hours, they can't afford a house, they can't be successful enough to attract a mate. Thus, their ability to reproduce declines. Once the ability to reproduce gets weaker, it means people start to tear the system apart, because if you're screwed in the current system, you're going to roll the dice to get a different outcome. Because if you're screwed in the current route, you have an incentive to roll the dice with a revolution or a political crisis, even though it means you could die, because that gives you at least some shot. And so what happens as
I mean, it's crazy to think about it. Like,
Dang
it used to
ads.
cost millions
Just such
to
an
advertise on
interruption.
TV, and
inequality grows, quality of life decreases, is the population splits up into different sub-factions based on the self-interest of different groups. So in medieval France, it was the Armagnacs versus Burgundians. In 17th century England, it was the parliamentarians versus the royalists. And all of these underlie some underlying class or ethnic or regional difference, where royalists versus cavaliers was the old nobility based out of Western England versus the capitalists based out of Eastern England.
So I want to speak to this. This is so true, and this is something we studied a lot in global development and the decline of nations and emergence of civil war, and war politics, geopolitics, those kinds of courses that I took is and things that I studied, is that particularly when you have men who feel disenfranchised and who feel that modern society offers them that they have nothing to lose in their current context or modern society, you get political violence. Like, that's just the course of history. That's what happens. And I think that's what a lot of people, particularly those who are of the middle class or even upper class, especially those in kind of the upper and elite classes, need to realize, is that there is a large amount of young men ages 16 to 30 who feel that they have no future in society as it is now. I would say probably, my personal estimate would be like 20% of young men in that age range. Hey, Millie, I'll pick you up in a moment. And so if we don't recognize that and properly respond to it as a society and just write them off and call them incels and whatever, which do a lot of them believe problematic things, have problematic views towards women and stuff? Yes. But if we don't address the root causes of why they feel the way they feel, and instead just write them off, that's not going to lead somewhere healthy for us as a society. So it's tough, because you can't validate the conclusions they arrive at, but you can validate the things that cause their trend in that direction in the first place.
And then you have the whites versus the reds in the Russian Revolution, the optimates versus the populares parties in Republican Rome. And in us, it's the right versus the left. And the right versus the left underlies, there's a couple different correlations you can stack, but the one I go after most is college educated versus uncollege educated. Every single thing the left pushes makes the college educated better off. Every single thing the right pushes mostly the merchant class, but also religious and military interests. And there's other stuff you can stack, like cities versus countrysides, male versus female, high agency versus low agency. If you have low agency at your work, you're almost certainly going to be a leftist. And even if you have high agency, like you're a small business owner or a farmer, even if you're poor, you're going to be conservative. So this is the underlying difference. As times get worse, what happens is that people get desperate, and so they support their faction over the centralized government, because the centralized government's not going to give you any stuff. You don't appeal to moderates because the moderates aren't going to. They haven't done crap for you. So you're going to support a radical that supports your self-interest. And so the right and the left have become further and further radicalized until what I predict will happen is that America will have a civil war or revolution within the next 1 to 5 years. And I can explain that more if you'd like.
You are someone that spent a lot of time.
I love how he drops a bomb like that, and then it's just like, I can explain that more if you'd like. Like, you wouldn't. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that conclusion. I do think we are at a moment in history where something has to give, something has to change in American politics. I imagine 2028 is going to be a very interesting time because we'll be past, like, Trump can't run anymore. The left will have to have figured out whatever the heck they're doing because they're all over the place. They have the left is a, let's be real. The Democratic Party right now is not, it is not led by people so far as we see, engage, interact with, support, whatever. It is a party machine that installs who they want to lead what they want, and it's like the opposite of the populist problem we have with Donald Trump. With Donald Trump, there's this guy, some really not great characteristics, who is leading and who has committed crimes, like, verifiably, and has been convicted of those crimes. And then on the right, or on the left, you have people who, I don't know who's running the show, because Biden is in bad enough mental decline that even the Democratic Party finally said, like, yeah, he can't run for re-election. So that means basically right now, do you really think he's governing? I don't. I'm not getting political here, but, like, just based on the evidence, I don't think he is governing right now. In terms of, like, attending meetings and stuff, sure, maybe, but the people actually calling the shots, advising him, writing his scripts, writing his policies, doing whatever is being done, that's not him. It's the party machine, right? And I think anyone who is objective should be able to reach that conclusion. So all of that to say, that's 2028 will be interesting, because I feel like we're going to reach a point where Trump can no longer, like, this kind of idolatry of an individual can no longer continue on the right, per se. I mean, maybe, we'll see. Maybe he has some protege emerge in the next 4 years. And then on the left, there we'll see if people emerge in some capacity to actually lead as individuals, with agency, rather than this machine just continuing the interests of essentially an oligarchy. But I don't know. We'll see. Maybe he's right about civil war. Hopefully not.
Thinking about alternative histories, what do you think would have happened if Trump had been shot?
That's a great question. So the reason I've been thinking about that, and I actually predicted Trump would be assassinated 2 years in advance, because there are 4 historic conflicts I use as parallels for our current era. And what I do is I look, it's almost like string theory, where you can find certain historic parallelisms and you follow them, and they often turn out to be true. Those 4 historic periods are the English Civil War, the American Civil War, the French Revolution, and the fall of the Roman Republic. With the fall of the Roman Republic, what happened is that Rome became a great nation and conquered the world. And for those that are the known world, from Syria to Spain. And for those that don't know, Rome was a democracy. It had 2 political parties that competed against each other, the optimates and the populares. And from my study, I found that the populares are more so Republicans and the optimates are Democrats. The optimates were more so the Roman deep state, and they had allies in Rome's foreign allied countries. So in the same way the Democrats have allies in Europe or Canada or Australia, the optimates had allies in Greece or North Africa or Turkey. And so what happened was that Rome became this great country, and Rome imported a third of its population as slaves. And so the slaves depreciated the local labor of the native Romans, and so they fell into poverty. So income inequality became absurd, where you had men who were equivalent to Zuckerberg or Elon Musk, who could buy entire countries. Then what happened is Rome also saw a feminist movement, degradation of its moral code, collapse of its religion, and collapse of traditional Roman culture as the Roman middle class died. Rome spiraled into immense political polarization between the optimates and the populares. And the Gracchi brothers, in our parallel, because there are multiple cycles I look at, the largest one I know of is the civilizational cycle, in which America parallels Rome very strongly. And the Gracchi brothers were wealthy tycoons who operated off a platform of make Rome great again. They wanted to reinstall the Roman middle class and bring back traditional Roman values at the expense of the wealthy elites and the deep state. What happened first is that the populares, is that the optimates deep state, they slandered the Gracchis and then said that they were trying to make themselves tyrants. They couldn't run for office, but because they were trying to destroy the democracy and to make themselves tyrants. Then when that didn't fail, they assassinated the Gracchi brothers. What then happened is that the populares, or their version of what I think are the Republicans, spiraled into warlords. And so this is a great parallel for what I think is going to happen to America. I think the right will crush the left, but the right lacks so little internal ideological unity that the right will spiral into ideological warlords who will kill each other. In the same way that for the populares beat the optimates, and then inside the populares were you had various strong men like Augustus, like Julius Caesar, like Marius, Octavian, and the problem with both the populares and the Democrats is that they can't pull on groups of fighting men. Because if you're the populares or the populists, they can get all these young Roman men to fight for them by offering them stuff. But once you've alienated that, you have to rely on foreign mercenaries, which is what I think the left would do if it was caught in an actually violent conflict, where they would try to build up a military of people from Mexico or Europe or Southeast Asia or whatever.
So the obvious...
I want to put my perspective and push back on some of the conclusions he's reaching here is that I don't yeah my baby's just she's interjecting. She's got some thoughts to add, but the conclusions that I think he reaches here are flawed for one chief reason. I don't see a civil war being society-wide. I see something much more likely that we would see insurgency and something like January 6th unended, like January 6th on repeat, like terrorist attacks, like what we have with lone shooters, lone gunmen, when they are ideologically motivated. They are. Yeah, I'm just gonna pick her up real quick. So, got Bebe here. But when you have a shooter who is ideologically motivated, that is a terrorist attack, right? That's terrorism. And so I think that we're much more likely to see kind of skirmishes and attacks in that way as a sort of rebellion against society. And I see it even being because like people like those who are in far right militias would argue that they're pro-America, they're for the American people and stuff, right? So they're not necessarily oftentimes going to attack just general population centers. I would see it being more likely that they attack things like a DNCHQ or CNN's office, or these things that they see as the enemy, as the propagandists, as the elites, things like that. That it would be more of a war between these fringe groups and who they perceive as elite or propping the elite. But Juan, yeah. Am I supposed to be annoyed by what guy says? Like what this guy says? Is that what you're saying? Yo, Camden, glad to have you in here. And Eli, yeah, like exactly with what you said with Kamala. Agreed. But yeah, I'll go ahead and mute myself so you don't hear baby interjecting, and we'll continue.
Thing that people think is something like, Rudyard, the nice idea, lessons from history, but we're beyond that barbarism now. We're sort of an ascended species. Look, I can predict the weather in Venezuela tomorrow, and I can track what's going on with global news, and I've got air conditioning, and I've got a car to take me around. The interesting thing that you said at the very beginning is this sort of assumption that we've mastered the world. We've mastered social movement, social psychology, human psychology, health, science. Everything is sort of within our control. And if you believe that, then you don't need to learn from the lessons of history because you assume that you're sort of out and apart from that. What would you say to someone that says, yeah, it's like nice idea that that happened in Rome or that happened in the French Revolution or whatever? I don't see the parallel. There's not going to be a land war. We're not going to see a kinetic altercation between left and right in America. That seems unbelievable.
I'm going to answer that question, but I'll posit another question to you first. If we don't use history to study the world, what else are we supposed to look at?
I don't know what people think that they're using.
Exactly. So what I say is that if you're not using history to study the world, you're making stuff up. Because the reason we don't like this, I said before, the reason people don't like studying history is that you're expected to be accountable to it because there's this shared truth. And we've had people who have been analyzing history from as long ago as Herodotus, the Bible, Ibn Khaldun, the Chinese historians like Sima Qian, and they all hit the same points. And we are actually part of their narrative, but we can't explain their narrative. And I'll explain what that means. Where the reason we don't want to do this is the left, which is one of the things I like to say is that even conservatives are leftists today because the left has built up the modern worldview so much that even if you try to escape the leftist worldview, you're still operating off leftist assumptions. I just brought up class analysis. That was something Marx invented.
I don't think that's true.
The idea of equality being good, that's a Marxist idea. The idea that the government should help people push for greater social betterment is Marxist. And so the left wants to project.
I don't think that's exclusively Marxist. That's pretty silly, especially considering it's in the U.S. Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal under God or whatnot, or the ideas of the equality of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Like these things they predate Marx. Now Marx was inspired, like I would say some of the ideas of Karl Marx, like politics is a horseshoe, some of the ideas of Karl Marx and the political right, or not even political right, but like communism and democracy are often I've got a binky in my hand. Communism and democracy are often juxtaposed as these two far separate things, but they kind of end up meeting at their most fringe realities, meeting in some way nearly in a sort of horseshoe shape. I do strongly believe that politics is a horseshoe. So what he attributes to Marx, I would say it's not necessarily that this originated with Marx. It's that certain elements of democratic theory and Republican theory and the things that inspired the U.S. Constitution are in common with certain elements of what drove Marx to see the world in the way that he did. Now, they come to very different conclusions, and I think Marxist conclusions are very concerning. But all that to say, the ideas of equality for people, like, those are shared, right? Now, equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunity, very different. But equality itself, the idea of equality being a value, a moral good, is shared. So that's all I'll add there.
It's basically religious vision of the world, and the only way they can do that is by saying history is not important. And it's a tale as old as time inside history that wealthy eras get arrogant, where it's called decadence. It happened to the Greeks, the Romans, the Indians, the Chinese. And we are decadent. And decadent societies think they've mastered everything. They think they've accomplished everything. And then they grow weak. And then a new, stronger faction emerges and wipes them out. So you can explain our hubris by being an extreme form of decadence that we are the wealthiest society in history, and thus we are even more delusional. And what I would say is that every single era, to differing degrees, thinks their era is special. Then you look back, and no one is special. If you see these patterns going back thousands of years, and it always comes back around, and if we think we're special and we're unwilling to look at the dozens of times before we weren't special, that's legitimately a form of madness. If you want to completely ignore the outside evidence and then just believe your inner truth, that it fits the definition of madness.
What's this got to do with Trump being shot at?
To get started in data analytics, you don't need
I love-
previous experience.
love
or
his
a degree.
pushback.
The Google Data Analytics Certificate.
Not even pushback per se, but just like, all right, like, what does this mean? I think we'll get to why there will be a far right backlash, and then we'll respond to that with, okay, like, let's actually, well, man, it looks like later he does talk to what's the right getting wrong. But we will jump all the way to how young men can stay positive, and then we'll probably just wrap it up. Maybe I'll jump on. We'll share these other ones sometime, another time, or you can just watch them if you want. This video was fascinating. How I made millions as the world's best trader with Gary Stevenson. He has a YouTube channel, Gary's Economics. Highly recommend. But he is going to be left of center in his conclusions. So it's good to have have some people on the left and the right informing your perspectives from their best arguments. But yeah,
you have to look at the parallels between the future and the past, in which things can get bad because they have consistently gotten bad. And so if you choose not to look at it, it's going to catch you in the dark and slit your throat. And I would say, like, because I can talk at all these ideas, I can talk at the abstractions, the statistical models, but what I'd say is look outside. Like, go to Los Angeles, go to New York City, go to parts of Austin, and things aren't good, and then compare it to a photo reel of the 1960s. Look at your own personal life, look at the lives of everyone around you. Most people are depressed, poor, lonely, sexless, angry, have mental health issues. Most people's lives aren't good.
I think something important to note here is this is going to vary widely. Like that in and of itself, I would say, is kind of a bubble statement. I personally think there's kind of two Americas right now. There's one in which things are okay, maybe not great, but they're not horrible. And there is another America that is separate from that one. That is, there's there's barely even a middle class today. It's kind of like either you're above middle class or you're less than middle class. And I think the second America that has had wages stagnating for 50 years, that feels disenchanted, that feels disenfranchised and stuff, that feels forgotten and ignored, those people would feel the way that Rudyard Lynch is talking about. And especially people ages 16 to 30, particularly men, feel that way. And so sometimes my concern with stuff that Rudyard says, aka what if alt hist, that he says on his main channel, is definitely seems like he has more of kind of the red pill kind of crowd in his surroundings, and sees, I think there's value in, like I said at the beginning of this, acknowledging their concerns and their pains and the things that are challenging them in the world. But also, if that's all you see, then you're going to get a very warped or different perspective of the world and the reality currently within the US than you would if you have a more diverse set of friends, peers, influences, colleagues, etc.
And that's true on both a statistical and anecdotal basis. And furthermore, in the last month, Trump was nearly assassinated. The Democrats had to pull Kamala out as a candidate. They had to replace Biden with Kamala. And there have been states that have taken Trump off the ballot. The last two elections have been disputed. And so for each case, these are things that have only happened in the previous American Civil War. And so just look out.
Okay, let's not validate the disputing that happened of the American elections. That didn't happen because of anything inherently wrong with the elections. As the evidence came out and showed, it happened because of candidates and people that we're dissatisfied with the results. But that's two very different things. Like Venezuela's election that just happened, that was a fraud. Fraudulent, fake. Like Maduro, not Maduro, who's his successor? No, is it Maduro? I don't know. Whoever the current president is should not be president. Clearly cheated. Like very different realities from like what American election like dissatisfaction is about.
Outside, the things, we've had enough warning shots at this point.
I'm not sure that I would agree with the everybody's life anecdotally is worse than it would have been in the 1960s. I don't know enough
He said, there we go, same thing I said.
specifically about America.
20% has it better, 80% has it worse. It's comparable to dating, where what happened with income inequality and various things is the top 20% did vastly better and the bottom 80% did worse. So I'm using everyone colloquially.
I see. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm not fornicating with the 80% sufficiently well. But I don't know, man. I understand what you mean. There is certainly an awful lot of problems, whether it's coming from the mate inside, whether it's coming from economics, whether it's coming from real wages and what they can buy, whether it's coming from a psychological health standpoint, a psychic health standpoint. But I look around me, and I don't only hang around with highfalutin, sort of super successful
Yes.
people, and many of those people are flourishing. Not only that, but almost all of them are in relationships. Almost all of them are getting married. Almost all of them are having kids. And they're teachers, they're builders, they're plumbers, they're fucking Uber drivers. You know, they're not that homogenous when it comes to being in some super upper
Yes.
echelon. So my sort of lived experience is different. That being said, I do see the data. So I have this discordance between what is being reported to me and then what I sometimes experience in my own life. All of that to say, what would have happened if Trump had been shot? What
Oh.
would have happened? How would the world
Chris is like, tell me this, like, give me your perspective. That's the third time he's brought it up.
be different?
I thought I answered that. The right would spiral into factions, where the issue with the right today is that there's no unifying ideology. The right is a various coalition of various anti-left factions. And so the right has libertarians, it has populists, it has religious people, it has boomer cons, fascists, and the right is held together by Trump's cult of personality. And I think this is something conservatives have to be careful about, that Trump's in his 70s. In no timeline is he going to live for the next few decades. And so what happened with the fall of the Roman Republic, with the death of the Gracchus, is that after the death of the Gracchus, the basically Republicans lose faith in the system, so you start seeing violence. There's in and out violence, in which people lose faith that the system has any service for them, and so they lose the incentive to cooperate with others. And what would happen is, I think that there would be blood in the street if Trump got shot. I think I think parts of the military would mutiny. I think various militias and stuff would kill people. There'd be riots in major cities. I don't know how bad the blood would be. The death of Trump is not my first target, is not one of the dominant variables I would use to predict a civil war, but I completely think that there would be violence. And the thing is, even the reason the left is, or the reason both sides are incredibly weak now, the Democrats and the Republicans are not operating under strong platforms. And so anything could knock them over at this point. And then inside them are various sub-factions where the left's been eaten up by wokeness, it just gets more and more radical each time it happens, while the right is all these different sub-factions. And so I would guess, and I'm just throwing this out here, you would see maybe someone like an Elon, someone like a Republican senator rise to a new leadership, and then you would compete with other Republicans for dominance inside the coalition.
Staying hydrated can be boring, but it doesn't need to be. The problem is that most hydration
I would agree with his conclusion, particularly about there would have been blood in the streets. I remember when Trump first got shot, before we knew anything, but it was like news, and there was blood coming from his ear, but you couldn't really tell in the video, like if it was his ear, or if he had been hit in the head somewhere, or maybe he'd been shot. Like we didn't know if there were any body shots or anything on him. And I was like, if he dies, we're not leaving our house for like a couple of days, because it just the potential. I don't think people realize how much of a powder keg we live in sometimes, where like if that had happened, like we would yearn for the days of only having internet conspiracy theories again, because people would have lost their minds, and there would have certainly been not just civic and civil unrest, but some violence for sure. And I would not be leaving suburbia, be hunkering down for that duration of time.
How does this relate to your predictions for a coming far-right backlash?
The reason I say that we're going to have a far right backlash is the same reason that the why I think that we are going to have a revolution. Because what I see now, and I've looked at this through various different ways, is the elite now is incredibly stupid and foolish and arrogant. And they don't know how little they don't know. Meanwhile, you have this giant population of young men who are very well armed. They have nothing to lose. They're hopeless, and they can be easily manipulated. And so that's first two variables. Third variable is that wokeness is very poorly constructed because it establishes no incentives for cooperation. If you're a straight white man, wokeness will never be nice to you no matter what you do. Meanwhile, they can't control the behavior of the people who are in their preferred racial or ethnic groups, where if you're a black Muslim gay person, everything you do is fine. They can't control your behavior. So wokeness has got a lot of structural issues, and I can't believe they did it because they've pushed wokeness so hard that it's basically built up this obvious resentment against it. And that resentment is going to get loosened somewhere. And so, to repeat, foolish, arrogant elite, young white men, and also DEI and the economy have really screwed over young white men so they can't succeed in the current corporate system. And then you have a suicidally delusional ideology. So it's like you have two rooms, one building up pressure and one without enough pressure, and they're going to hit an equilibrium.
So me and you have spoken about this a couple of times before. My male sedation hypothesis versus your incel far-right uprising. Uh, Give your sort of insight about where you think young men are at the moment, mental health, their desire for revolution and such.
I've had this debate a bunch, or not, I've had this discussion a lot of times. And the point that we've often ended up, I'm jumping 3 points ahead in the conversation, is that the conversation we often have is what I say is most young men won't want to fight. There's small cadres of radicals who will push for it. And then what happens is that those radicals are the people in charge. So if you look at these conflicts, the Jacobins were the French Revolution. They were less than 1% of France's population. Literally, you could look at this is such a cool fact. You could look at the political subfactions of the French Revolution based off what cafes they went to.
You're
And
kidding me.
no, really. So different political radicals in the French Revolution went to literally different cafes in Paris. You could map out the political radical factions based off what streets the cafes they went to were. So you're operating off groups that are that small. The Bolsheviks, where they won the Russian Civil War, they were all communists were 3% of their population, and the Bolsheviks were a minority of that. The Puritans who won the English Civil War, they were 10% of the population. The American Revolution, no one wanted the American Revolution 5 years before it started, and then it just got ratcheted up over time. So I like when people ask me, Rudyard, what are the different subdivisions inside the right? I say most people have no clue what's happening. Most people don't know what's going on. They don't really have a concept of what's going to happen next. And then you have these factions of radicals that jockey. And before the English Civil War, people said the English have grown too weak to fight. And this was in the 1600s. It had been over a century since England had a civil war. What happened then is that the royalists and the parliamentarians, they just conscripted people. Same thing with the French Revolution, same thing with the Russian Civil War. The normies don't organize. They don't say, let's have a riot for normies, let's push normies, normies forever. The radicals organize, and then they conscript the normies. So most of the population can just want to play video games and do sports. What you need is you need to have small factions of radicals that are capable of conscripting the normies.
I have to finish writing this paper. I'm swamped.
Just get Grammarly. It's free.
Can it help?
What was that stat that you came up with? 20% are motivated, 60% will do whatever somebody says.
Yeah.
What's that thing?
So I pulled that from game theory, where it's a bunch of different things. Where in game theory, you've consistently found, and this is I've studied multiple game theory studies on this. In general, 60% of the population will do what the group tells them to do. And so we have various game theory studies. One is, do you contribute to the pot or do you take away? 20% of the population always contributes, even if against their self-interest. 20% tries to cheat whenever they can, and then 60% tries to just does whatever the group consensus is. And for certain things, like, will you put up the sign in front of your house? If for various studies, if you can change the neighborhood consensus, that will move it 60 points. So if the neighborhood consensus says don't put this sign up, 18% of people do it. If the neighborhood consensus changes, it moves up to 88. It moves up to 88, 78%. Yeah.
Yes.
And so most people today are in ennui. They don't know what they really want. They don't know what they're really doing.
What's an ennui for the people that don't know?
Oh, yeah. Ennui is a French word for a lack of comprehension, a lack of connectiveness to your world, and a lack of feeling connected to your life.
It's like an existential angst.
It is, yes, yes. And so most people don't know what's happening because the 2010 mind cannot comprehend our world, and most people are still mentally stuck in 2010. And I like to say that the way I would explain life today to my teenage self is, I would say, we became a sci-fi dystopia, but most people can't reach that conclusion. And so they're kind of stuck in this middle ground. So our current period is a period in which all of these factions are squabbling over who will become the dominant culture in a way that's comparable to the Jacobins squabbling among other French radicals, the Bolsheviks squabbling among other Russians, we're in the building up period. And as Lenin said, there are hours in which decades happen, and there are decades in which nothing happens. And so
I totally agree with that. That society right now is in a culture war, different than what you might associate with the term as it's been before. Society is deciding what will be the dominant culture going into the rest of the 21st century in the West. That is happening not only in the US, also in much of Europe, and it is not only two-sided. So we're presented with this idea that it is left and right, liberal and conservative, etc. But it is so important for Christians to remember that as Christians, we have this third way. We have a different culture with a different basis, with a different foundation than either of those sides can offer to us. And with that, it is essential that we bring that culture forward and that we do not define. So, like Christian nationalism, the problem with it is that it attempts to define by force from the top down what society will be, that you will act Christian. You will be a Christian society, which is just not how Christianity, true transformation of the soul, works. That's not how Christian morals are empowered by transformed hearts and minds renewed by Christ, right? And so the Christian can easily give in to the temptation and the sway of the easy solution, particularly from the right or the conservative side of, we can instill our social culture upon the world, just like embrace Christian nationalism, just like elect us, just do this, do that. And in that process, forsake the actual hard work and communal work and on the ground work, everyday work that we're called to, of demonstrating Christ, making disciples, baptizing the nations, bringing true heart and mind renewal that subsequently transforms the culture, first in our homes, then in our neighborhoods, then in our cities, then in our states, and then in our countries and the world. It is a sequential bottom-up theory of change. It is the way that the Roman Empire was changed from a society where it was okay to say, I don't want this baby, leave it on the street, to a society that said even abortion is wrong, which, yes, has been a Christian stance you might not know since like the 200s-300s, since the start, but we have record of it as early as the 200s or 300s. So the big key here.
The keys.
What?
The keys.
the keys, like the house keys. So, anyways, that's my point on that front. But
So history works. You don't realize it's going to happen until it slams you in the face, like the start of World War I or the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is just how things happen. Tensions gradually build up. If you're the kind of person who looks for this stuff, you see it. Otherwise, you continue your life. And then it just hits.
You're really stretching.
okay, we're gonna pop over to. We've been on here for a while, so we're gonna go ahead and pop over to what they say about how young men can stay positive, and we will contrast that against what God says.
Picture this. You're sitting at
Okay,
home alone
BetterHelp.
watching YouTube
I
videos,
am good to
wondering
go.
why you can't find the motivation to do the thing.
The things I guess maybe that a lot of people might be feeling after this conversation is, well, fucking hell, Rudyard, thank you for that. Very sort of fatalistic,
Beep. Sorry, guys.
nihilistic, cynical view of the future. I know that you try and have worked hard, both for yourself and for your audience, to come up with rules and a worldview and strategies to actually be hopeful and to kind of counter a lot of the bad advice that's given to young men.
Yes.
Where do you go to for that, given all of the potential chaos in the future and it's all going to be hard and blah, blah, blah? What's some sort of firm footing? What do you rely on when it comes to this discussion?
That's a good question. In Eastern mysticism, in Hinduism and Buddhism and stuff, there's this concept of do not look at the associations your mind makes of things. Let's say you feel sad. Just focus on the feeling of being sad. Don't think about what it reminds you of. Don't think about what what your mind immediately jumps to. And so the mind naturally makes lots of things that it doesn't actually relate to the thing that you are directly speaking about. And so I tell you what I believe to be the truth. I tell you this because I see it as my duty to tell you the truth. What you choose to do with it is your choice. And what I think there's no right answer for everyone. And whenever people give advice to everyone, I don't think it's useful because everyone's so different. So whenever a friend asks me for advice, I say, what do you like to do? What are you good at? What do you better vis-a-vis everyone else? Look for the asymmetric advantage. So I'm not going to give your entire crowd advice because I don't know who you are, random guy listening in Florida. And what I will say though, I have a couple different things
I can give you all advice. Just one advice: repent and be baptized and saved. Like, not that the baptism brings us salvation, but it is repent, be saved, and be baptized. Yes, that is one universal thing that I would love for all of you to do, to believe in Jesus Christ as Lord. But that's about the only universally applicable thing that I can suggest.
say. The first is that just live your life. Like one of the things I tell myself is the world could go to crap, but I'm still here to chill. I'll still do cool events. I'm still gonna do what I want to do. I'm still gonna make friends, travel to places, read new books. That doesn't have a bearing on the outside world. Like you read about Winston Churchill lived through so many horrifying wars, but he had a great life. And that's what I think you can do. And what I would say is try to find I think religion is the biggest thing that helps people with this stuff. When you have a grounding in the world, irrespective of the outside world, it's like you have a soul. And once you have a soul, you have an ability to have a differentiation between the insanity of the world and yourself. And what I tell young men especially, and I gather your audience is probably majority male, is what are you willing to die for? Because for men to have something worth living for, you need to have something worth dying for. And so if you're dying in a ditch, what cause do you want to be dying in a ditch for? And so figure out your asymmetric advantages, figure out what you want to die for, find some kind of spiritual grounding. And
I would avoid the what you want to die for thing because, I mean, just look at the Islamic extremism stuff of the 2000s. Lots of men willing to die for things that they didn't want to live for. They did, in fact, die for certain things because they were given certain promises by Islamic extremism and promises in the afterlife and stuff. And so I would not posit that. I think that's a way to potentially create some problematic martyrdom situations. So, what is the life you want? how can you get there? Like, what can you do to maximally increase your odds of getting to that life within moral bounds and pursue that, like, faith aside, faith advice aside. But I do appreciate his understanding of the value of religion in terms of driving purpose and morality, particularly Christian religion. He talks about Christianity a decent bit.
And I mean, Nietzsche said, don't get stuck in the house of morality. And this is something I see with a lot of creators, especially conservative creators. They're so stuck on hating the left. Assume the left is completely evil, just for this one sentence argument. What's next? If the left is evil, what do you do next? And that's my answer for this. And I went through, upon realizing these things, I went through like a 1 or 2 year grieving process where I had to think, okay, because people say like it's weird or schizo to be obsessed with politics. But no, politics is life. If it's World War II, and it's differing degrees. Politics isn't life in 1984. If it's World War II, you're dying in a ditch in Stalingrad. Politics became your life. These macro political decisions became your life. And so my assumption growing up was that we would live in this John Hughes Simpsons America where you go to college and you get a good job and then you get married. And I realized that wasn't going to happen. So I thought to myself, what's next? Because if that's not going to happen, what am I going to do next? And over time, I realized I prefer this to the old life. It's better to play a difficult game and feel your heart breathe than play a boring game.
Yeah, I think, there's so much about the advice that's given to young men, which is perverted at the difficult situation. I mean, you both agree on this, wildly unpopular among most of the people that are sort of male content creators, which is that the crisis of femininity and the sort of female, impending sort of female psychological problems are maybe going to at least compete with what guys are suffering with at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. That's something that you and I are in agreement on. And I actually think women have it worse than men. In that I think women are more dependent upon their community and society. And thus, if that goes bad, they have less of an ability to handle the toughness or adjust than men. And like every single girl in the age of 25 I've met has at least one mental health condition. At this point, it's a game where I try to guess which in advanced. And it's crazy that there's an entire, I mean, Zoomers are split between 20% who are very effective and 80% who are ineffective. And I mean, I think there's enough suffering in the world. Why do we have to add more? Like, I mean, women are suffering, men are suffering, the poor are suffering, the rich are suffering.
Having a competition like that, it's one of the very odd things about that I was thinking about as I was doing some research this morning for this episode, is that the framing of sort of intersectionality, victimhood hierarchy that is heavily criticized by guys on the right is also used by them to say, well, yeah, but women don't have it as bad as me.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've lived a bizarre life. And so I've met a lot of different people, rich people, poor people, famous people, not famous people. Everyone's got a person. Everyone's a person. Everyone's got a soul. Just because someone has an identity that's not yours doesn't mean they don't have a soul. And the thing I can't compromise on is that once you start treating your political enemies like they don't have souls, that's just evil. Bad things are going to happen. And your victimhood
It's valuable. That's a word.
argument's interesting, where the further right you go, the more psychologically you end up like the left in a bunch of different ways. Do you want me to explain? So the far right, and ironically, they were the same movement until around 1850. And then they were both part of the revolutionary movement. Then you had national revolutionaryism, and then you had leftist revolutionaryism. So Nazis and communists were the same in the early 19th century. And so hard right, obsession over your social status, obsession over blood, lack of a concept of a soul, the idea that the government should run society, ideas of Manichaeism or everything is good versus evil, ideas of revolutionaryism. You have, I mean, the Nazis and the Soviets both had gulags. They killed different people, but they both had the death camps.
And what about the left? What's the equivalent? Far left.
Oh, yeah, it's the communists. I mean,
He's like, duh.
the far left equivalent, they also think the government should run everything. They also think that your birth determines who you are. If you're born upper class, you're part of the bad guys. If you're born working class, you're a good guy. They also don't believe in a concept of the soul. They both believe that if we kill an outgroup, the world becomes perfect. That's either the Jews or the capitalists. They both don't see the world as an organic living place. They both really don't have a concept of God either. And it's funny that the most hard right guys are philosophically the least Christian people in the political spectrum, where the left and even the techno-optimists, they take a lot of implicit Christian assumptions. The hard right fascist guys are the least philosophically Christian, even though they often say, I'm hardcore tradcath. So, yeah, they also think that they're both authoritarian, and they both think that in order to achieve these, they're both often rationalizations for killing people too.
I loved that moment. I'm a hardcore trad
brought you here today to let you.
Where would you?
All right, and then the last bit is just his recommended books. But yeah, I would say it's valuable probably to listen to this whole thing if you'd like, with a critical eye, and just what's the term, like, eat the fish, spit out the bones. Similar here. Well, there's not really any bones to spit out with this, because it's more just his journey that got him to where he is. But Gary's Economics, just his YouTube channel in general, has some interesting stuff. Same thing here with this interview of Rudyard with his YouTube handle there. What if alt-hist? Like, what if alternate history is what that stands for. This I listened to about 20 minutes through. I have not listened to the whole thing. So I can't like really endorse it. But he does address like five, I think this is the interview where he addressed like five factors that signal a decline in society. Five specific things. One of which is like a surging government spending problem, which to me is one of the most impending, like, concerning problems politically for the US. It might have been this one. It might have been another one. It might have been this one. That's okay. I'm just going to click this link too, because I did watch part of this one. It might have been this one where he talked about Civil War a bit more in depth, and he talked about these factors such as income inequality that could contribute. But anyways, there's lots of stuff to learn. Listen to people you disagree with. That's like one of the big things here. Even people who say some things that you find somewhat morally concerning, it's not, I wouldn't say surround yourself with them, but be aware of the things they're putting forward. Be aware of the arguments that they're telling society, partially so that, when you encounter people who listen to them, you can counter those things, and partially so that, sometimes you'll realize that people who you thought had deeply problematic perspectives maybe just have some things where it's like, you know what, you come to different conclusions to some extent. There are truly problematic conclusions, but sometimes it's just a matter of perception. You perceived that they had problematic conclusions, but really, hey, these are some reasonable gripes, some proper complaints, and I actually agree with this thing. You might agree with the people that you think you disagree with more than you would expect, particularly if you, person on the internet, identify kind of conservative or liberal or hard right, hard left. You might be surprised with the things that are said by those in different political, social, economic, cultural standing than yourself. So all of that to say, the one thing I want to reiterate here is that the solution to these challenges cannot be found in this world. I think one of the greatest problems with modern society is that it is deeply post-Christian. However, the solution to that is not a Christian state or Christian nation. It is a nation of Christians, is what I would argue. So if you want to see society change, if you want to see society transformed, if you want to see corporate greed decrease, if you want to see neighbors care for each other, if you want to see care for the poor prioritized, all of these things, guess what? Those are Christian values. And if you introduce people to Christ, and if we see a Christian resurgence and revival in this country, we will see more of those things, and those things are truly good. So if you want to see those things, do what you can at the ballot box to create the ideal society you want to see, but ultimately where it's going to happen is in the conversations, in the ministries, and the love you display, and the hearts that you bring to Christ. And that is what will bring about society as you desire to see it. So hope that's helpful. Thank you everybody who joined, and you guys have a good rest of your day.